World building has always been one of the most important elements of Star Wars and arguably the most gripping. The Star Wars universe ultimately mirrors our own, especially in how galactic society is laid out. Star Wars is and always has been a critique of the way our society operates, often highlighting the darker things we like to pretend don't exist. Vicious imperialism, soul-consuming ambition, and the bleak fate that awaits those unfortunate enough to be on the bottom of the ladder. The latter element is most commonly depicted in the form of slums, which are the run-down, neglected sections of otherwise prosperous planets. In this video, we'll be exploring the slums of Star Wars and the unpleasant forms in which they existed across the galaxy. The Star Wars galaxy has always been one starkly divided by inequalities, be them between humans and aliens, core worlders and rim worlders, or simply the rich and the poor. The galaxy's many slums were simply an expression of this. On many worlds, like Coruscant or Taurus, the lower class lived in a state of filth and despair, in contrast to gleaming, luxurious skyscraper penthouses built for the ruling class that oftentimes were part of the same building complexes. But as can be witnessed in the real world, poverty can sometimes be relative. So what did poor really mean in such an advanced society? Ultimately varied from world to world, of course. The refugees of Nar Shaddaa were a lot worse off than most of the inhabitants of the Coruscant underground, and the populations of less developed worlds would often categorically be considered poor by core world standards. But if we narrow things down to Ecumenopolises, the planetary cities that dominated galactic society, a bit more consistent of a picture emerges. To be honest, urban poverty in Star Wars wasn't so different from urban poverty in the real world, with the only exceptions really being technology. Even in the poorest regions of Coruscant, for example, nearly all homes were equipped with atmospheric scrubbers which recycled the air to make the underworld more breathing friendly. But technology is always a double-edged sword, or rather a double-bladed lightsaber. Advancements like high-speed swoop bikes, blaster technology, and easy-to-apply tracking devices made life in poorer, more crime-ridden places extremely dangerous. Swoop gangs were a perennial problem, and during more violent eras of the galaxy's history, groups of disaffected soldiers often menaced the slums as well. The exact conditions of slums varied from world to world, so going forward, we're going to be looking at three in particular: Nar Shaddaa's Refugee Sector, Taurus's lower city and undercity, and Coruscant's underworld. These three weren't the only slums in the galaxy, of course. There were many other Ecumenopolises with similar arrangements, from Alsacan and Humberine to Iridu and Denon. First things first, let's look at Nar Shaddaa's Refugee Sector as it existed in 3951 BBY. Arguably, Nar Shaddaa itself was one big slum. The moon was basically ruled by gangs and criminal enterprises, with the Hutts, the moon's official rulers, maintaining only a vague, conceptual semblance of law there. But the Refugee Sector was even worse than normal. Hastily built in the aftermath of the Mandalorian Wars, the sector served to house the millions of refugees that fled to Nar Shaddaa after losing their homes to the Mandalorian Wars and the subsequent Jedi Civil War. Housing in the Refugee Sector consisted almost entirely of low-quality, prefabricated structures and empty cargo containers, which were usually inhabited well beyond capacity by poor refugees. In addition to this, human disease spread unchecked in the sector, and hygiene was virtually non-existent, which further isolated the refugees from the rest of Nar Shaddaa. The Hutts didn't even pretend to police the sector, leaving the inhabitants to fend for themselves, something they had to do on a daily basis. Nar Shaddaa, you see, was unusual in that its population was overwhelmingly human. Humans represented less than 20% of the population, and many of the other species on the world resented them for their dominance everywhere else in the galaxy. Humans that left the refugee sector were often mugged or worse, and most inhabitants of the Smuggler's Moon openly treated the refugees as weak and inferior. Those refugees that weren't human were often treated similarly anyway, as they lived in a primarily human community. Furthermore, by the time of the end of the Dark Wars, the criminals of Nar Shaddaa had begun to clamp down on the sector hard. The Seriko Gang, a bitter group of mostly human veterans of the Mandalorian Wars' Battle of Sirocco, cut the refugees off from the edges of the skyscraper canyons on one side of the sector, severely limiting access to the sector and giving the refugees less room to live. On the other side of the sector, a branch of the exchange, a brutal galaxy-wide criminal syndicate set up shop, intent on pressuring the refugees into selling themselves into slavery. Were it not for Jedi exile Mitra Surik, the exchange likely would have been successful. Moving on, we have the planet Taurus, a world that, before it was ravaged by a Sith bombardment at the end of the Jedi Civil War, had not one but two sets of slums. The first was the Lower City, the most populous district of Taurus's Ecumenopolis. The Lower City, as far as slums go, wasn't all that remarkable. Life there was tough, but not quite Nar Shaddaa tough, even with the swoop gangs that ravaged the entire district. Around the time of Taurus's destruction, the swoop gangs were the most important of the problems faced by Lower City residents, as the two largest gangs, the Black Vulkars and the Hidden Becks, were engaged in an all-out war. What made the Lower City unique wasn't the conditions, but rather the inhabitants. The Lower City was overwhelmingly populated by non-humans, and for a very sinister reason. The laws of Taurus forbade aliens from living in the luxurious upper city or even the middle city without a permit, and to make matters worse, the alien population of the lower city was actively suppressed, with the Taurisian government making it difficult for aliens to even leave the planet. But Taurus had an even nastier slum, the Undercity. Technically, the Undercity wasn't even supposed to be inhabited. It was the utmost bottom of Taurus's planetary city, and its structures were sewers and maintenance shafts, prowled only by vicious mutant Rakghoul monsters. But following a civil war earlier in the planet's history, the Undercity received inhabitants other than the Rakghouls, the Outcasts, a group of humans that were banished from the upper city for rebelling against the powers that be. They lived in literal holes in the wall, surviving purely on whatever they could get from salvage and from trading with the gang members who occasionally passed through their makeshift village. But perhaps the most extreme and notable slum was the Coruscant underworld. Galactic City, which blanketed the galactic capital, was absolutely massive, standing over 5,000 levels above the planet's original crust. The lowermost 1,000 of these levels were almost completely uninhabitable by the time of the Galactic Civil Wars, and most of the levels between that point and the surface weren't much better. For most slum regions of the underworld, literally everything was artificial, from the light to the climate and to the ground itself. That alone made the Coruscant underworld incredibly unpleasant, and conditions only got worse from there. The various levels of the underworld were once the upper levels of Galactic City in ancient times, but you would never be able to tell by looking at any of the structures there. Most had been retrofitted to serve as part of the bases of newer, taller buildings, and the living spaces that remained were often much more cramped than was optimal as a result. They were also usually quite old, and it showed. Vermin infested the walls of entire levels of Coruscant, and appliances and utilities were often out of date in the slums of the underworld, resulting in expensive and sometimes deadly failures. And, of course, crime ran rampant in the underworld as well. The planetary government's attempts at cracking down on underworld crime were half-hearted at best, and always ineffective. There was law enforcement down there, to be fair, but the underworld police were few in number and at such a disadvantage against the crime syndicates that they were forced to conceal their identities while on the job to protect themselves and their families. The lowest levels of Coruscant's underworld was inhabited by beings even worse than the criminals and vermin. The Thon, zombie-like mutants that, like the Rakghouls of Taurus, stalked the fringes of Coruscanti society, seeking victims to devour. They were originally outcasts exiled from the surface, but the toxins and pollutants dominating the lower levels of Galactic City led to mutations that left them unrecognizable long ago. So, that's our rather depressing tour of the slums of the Star Wars universe, but as per usual guys, I want to know what you think. Would you like to see more videos on the actual society of Star Wars as a whole? Let me know in the comments section below and leave some recommendations as well so we can start working on those videos. Anyways guys, just before you go, you know the drill, make sure you check out all the links in the description below. Our Geetsly's gaming network is expanding every day on our Roblox and Gary's mod. We also have our main Discord server with over 5,000 members at the moment. And if you want to help support the channel more than you already are by watching this video, make sure you check out the Patreon. If you do donate, you get access to a special behind the scenes Discord. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.